April 29th, 1943. Kuban bridgehead, Southern Front. Major Aleksandr Pokryshkin slammed his Airacobra into a sudden dive the moment a German Bf-109G cut across his nose, the Messerschmitt's tracers ripping past his canopy as he dropped toward the deck. He didn't wait for his wingman, didn't call out the maneuver. He simply forced the American-built fighter into the one place German aces hated fighting, the low-altitude band where the P-39 reacted faster, rolled tighter, and hit harder than anything they expected from a rejected US design. The German pilot followed him down, committing fully to the chase. That was exactly what Pokryshkin wanted. At treetop height, the Messerschmitt lost its vertical advantage. Down here, the Airacobra behaved like a different aircraft, steady, balanced, and brutally responsive to small stick movements. Pokryshkin waited until the German closed to firing distance, then snapped the P-39 into a violent right roll, something few frontline Soviet fighters could survive at that speed. The 109 overshot instantly, its pilot unable to match the sudden maneuver. Pokryshkin reversed, slid in behind him, and fired a single round from the 37mm cannon. The shell tore through the German fighter's tail section, shearing the control surfaces cleanly. The Messerschmitt rolled once, twice, then plunged into the ground in a streak of black smoke. He didn't celebrate, didn't even look at the falling wreck. Another formation was ahead. 3 Ju-87 Stukas, pushing towards Soviet positions with 2 more escorts above them. Pokryshkin leveled out, aligned himself directly behind the bombers, and advanced the throttle until the Airacobra trembled under the strain. This was where the aircraft mattered most. Western evaluators had dismissed it for failing at high altitude. Pokryshkin didn't need altitude. He needed speed, stability, and a cannon that could kill with one shot. The first Stuka filled his gun sight. The second he fired the cannon, the bomber disintegrated mid-air, pieces scattering across the steppe. The others broke formation, panicking, and in that moment the escorts dove to intervene. Pokryshkin didn't climb to meet them. He stayed low, forcing the Germans into shallow pursuit angles where they lost their advantage. The P-39 could not outrun a 109 vertically, but it could outmaneuver one laterally, something German aces consistently failed to account for. The first escort came at him from above. Pokryshkin let the attack pass, counted the fraction of a second when the German lost visual, then pulled the Airacobra into a tight climbing turn that brought him directly onto the enemy's flank. The 109 pilot tried to roll clear, but the P-39's centerline weight made its roll rate faster and more stable. Pokryshkin closed the gap, fired a 2-shot burst, and watched the Messerschmitt's wing snap free like a cracked hinge. His wingman arrived moments later, entering the fight with disciplined lines that reflected his rigid training. Pokryshkin had drilled them endlessly. No chaotic dogfighting, no drawn-out climbing duels, no wasteful ammunition. Precision, control, ambush. The Airacobra was not a machine for flailing maneuvers. It was a scalpel, and he demanded they use it like one. Rechkalov's voice came over the radio. More escorts entering from the east. Pokryshkin scanned the sky. 3 additional 109s, likely an elite swarm judging by spacing and discipline. They were heading for him specifically, recognizing the threat. German pilots had begun to identify the Soviet ace by his behavior. The aggressive low entry, the refusal to climb, the devastating accuracy at close range. Pokryshkin angled the P-39 slightly upward, not enough to enter their altitude band, but enough to force the Germans to commit to a risky descent. As they dove, he rolled right and slipped beneath their attack line, watching all 3 fighters streak past overhead with too much speed to correct. He climbed just enough to align behind the trailing 109. The German pilot attempted a barrel roll escape, but executed it too slowly. Pokryshkin pulled the trigger. The cannon's recoil shook the cockpit like a hammer blow, and the 109 came apart in a burst of metal shards. 2 more Germans remained. Pokryshkin forced them downward, dragging them into a horizontal maneuvering fight, the domain where the Airacobra was unmatched. The mid-engine balance created perfect lateral control, allowing him to sit comfortably within angles that German fighters entered only with high risk. He slipped behind the second 109, fired a short burst, and saw the canopy explode outward as the pilot bailed too late. The final German didn't stay. He broke away and fled east, abandoning the mission entirely. As Pokryshkin regrouped with his flight, the battlefield below reflected the impact of his work. The German bombing run had collapsed before delivering ordnance. 2 Messerschmitts burned in the field. A third lay scattered across a gully. The Stukas that hadn't been destroyed had retreated. And his own aircraft, the one dismissed by American command as a failed interceptor, had just dominated an engagement against some of the best-trained pilots in the Luftwaffe. Back at the forward airstrip, mechanics swarmed the Airacobra before it even stopped moving. They worked silently, their eyes fixed on the broad scorch mark along the fighter's wing where a German round had grazed it. One crewman muttered under his breath, "They're targeting you now. The Germans know your aircraft." Pokryshkin didn't answer. He stepped down from the cockpit, handed his report to a waiting officer, and walked directly into the intelligence tent. Inside, he placed markers on a map showing the German attack direction, the escort altitude, and the moment their formation fell apart. His analysis was clinical, stripped of emotion. The Airacobra's advantages were not accidental. They were structural, predictable, exploitable. And every German pilot who underestimated the aircraft paid the price. One junior officer interrupted him. "Major, is it true the Americans didn't want this fighter?" Pokryshkin looked at him. "They didn't need it," he said, "but we do." He tapped the map again. "And the Germans," he pointed toward the symbols representing the downed Messerschmitts, "are starting to understand it." Pokryshkin stepped back outside, where the Airacobra waited, cannon drum reloaded, machine gun belts replaced, fuel topped. The aircraft looked ordinary, ungainly even, with its long nose and mid-fuselage bulge. But in his hands, against the enemies of this front, it was becoming something far more significant. A weapon built by one nation, rejected by 2, perfected by a third, and feared by the enemy that believed it understood every aircraft in the sky. He tightened his flight gloves, pulled himself back into the cockpit, and prepared for the next scramble. The German aces weren't finished, neither was he. He closed the canopy and signaled to the ground crew to pull the chocks. The Airacobra lurched forward as he advanced the throttle, climbing off the rough strip with a smoothness that belied the stress of the last sortie. Nothing in the aircraft felt fragile or hesitant. The Americans had rejected it for failing at high altitude, but Pokryshkin wasn't planning to fight at altitude. He intended to fight where the war was actually being decided, at the deck, in the dirty, chaotic air over the Kuban, where every decision was measured in meters and milliseconds. He leveled out low over the front, the smell of burning fuel drifting upward from the ground battle below. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries fired sporadic bursts toward distant shapes, their operators unsure whether the incoming dots were friend or foe. Pokryshkin banked left and formed up with Dementiev and Rechkalov, who had climbed out behind him. Neither pilot spoke. Both understood that the Luftwaffe would return almost immediately. When German ground operations stalled, they relied heavily on air power to break the deadlock, and the Kuban had become one of the most concentrated air battles of the entire war. The 3 P-39s climbed just enough to clear a series of ridges. Ahead, columns of smoke twisted upward from burning supply depots. German reconnaissance aircraft had been circling the region for hours, adjusting artillery strikes and identifying weak points in Soviet defenses. Pokryshkin swept his gaze across the sky until far off to the west he spotted the trembling outline of an FW-189 Flying Eye. The Luftwaffe's twin-boom reconnaissance craft was notoriously hard to catch, not because it was fast, but because it flew deliberately low and used terrain for cover in ways most Soviet fighters struggled to match. But the Airacobra was not most Soviet fighters. Pokryshkin dipped his nose and accelerated. The FW-189 crew noticed too late. The German observer fired a short burst from the rear gun, the tracers arching wide as Pokryshkin closed the distance. The P-39's gun sight locked onto the transparent cockpit pod, and the 37mm round he fired turned the reconnaissance aircraft into a cloud of splintered glass and shredded aluminum. The wreckage fell in pieces, landing across a field scattered with abandoned artillery crates. Rechkalov whistled over the radio. "You got their eyes," he said. "They're blind for 1 minute," Pokryshkin answered. "Not more." He wasn't wrong. Almost immediately, multiple dark specks appeared along the horizon, tightly formed, disciplined, unmistakably German. This was not a strike group. It was a hunter group, sent specifically to eliminate Soviet fighters, interfering with reconnaissance and bombing missions. The Luftwaffe rarely deployed these formations lightly. The pilots inside them were veterans, survivors of countless engagements across Europe. Pokryshkin raised the nose of his P-39 only slightly. No steep climb, no dramatic altitude grab. He held his position just above the ground, forcing the Germans into a shallow descent if they wanted to engage. This was the mistake Western testers never understood. The Airacobra was at its absolute peak performance when flown at ridiculous proximity to the Earth. It didn't need height. It needed instinct, precision, and a pilot who knew exactly when to trade energy and when to preserve it. The German formation split immediately, 2 Bf-109Gs diving on Pokryshkin, while 3 FW-190s attempted to cut off Rechkalov and Dementiev. The enemy had chosen correctly. If they killed Pokryshkin first, they hoped the rest of the Soviet unit would collapse without its tactical core. Pokryshkin watched the leading 109 approach with unwavering focus. The German pilot expected him to climb or turn early. Pokryshkin did neither. He waited until the attack was fully committed, then rolled left so sharply that his shoulder struck the cockpit frame. The P-39 slid beneath the diving Messerschmitt in a maneuver too low for the German to safely match. Pokryshkin stabilized the roll, pushed the throttle, and caught the attacker as it leveled out. The first burst from his machine guns tore fragments from the Messerschmitt's tail. The second burst, from the cannon, hit the engine block with a sound like a hammer striking stone. The 109 went straight down, vanishing in a spray of earth. The second German fighter hesitated, a fatal hesitation. Pokryshkin banked into him immediately. The German tried to reverse direction, but Pokryshkin anticipated the move and cut inside his vector, placing the Airacobra into a firing line that few opponents had ever escaped from. A single 37mm shell ended the duel, punching directly through the cockpit. Behind him, Rechkalov and Dementiev were locked in a chaotic engagement with the FW-190s. The 190 was a brutal, heavily armed aircraft, but its strength lay in vertical dives and climbs. Rechkalov refused to fight that battle. He dragged the enemy downward, forcing the heavier Focke-Wulf to maneuver horizontally. Dementiev slipped into position behind one of the Germans and destroyed it with a tight burst that shattered its right wing. The remaining 190s broke off, attempting to climb back towards safer altitude bands. Pokryshkin climbed just enough to maintain pressure, but refused to follow into their strength. He held them low, forcing them to bleed energy. When one made the mistake of flattening out to regain speed, he dove onto it from behind and fired a single cannon shot that split the fuselage open. Within minutes, the sky was nearly silent again. Pokryshkin reformed the flight and guided them toward a patch of rising smoke several kilometers north. Soviet infantry had been calling for air support since dawn, and German aircraft had made repeated attempts to cut the supply lines feeding the defense line. Pokryshkin kept his formation low and fast, scanning for more threats. They found them, 4 H's 129 ground attack aircraft, heavily armored, slow, and escorted by a pair of Bf-109s flying close protection. These aircraft were feared by tank crews. Their cannon pods could gut even a T-34 if left unchallenged. Pokryshkin tightened his harness. This engagement mattered. He didn't call for a climb. He didn't coordinate a wide pincer. He attacked immediately, accelerating the Airacobra until the frame vibrated with tension. The HS-129 pilot spotted him late and attempted to bank, but the aircraft were far too sluggish to evade a fighter like the P-39. Pokryshkin aimed for the lead attacker. The moment the gun sight centered, he fired, not once, but twice. The first round tore off the port engine. The second round detonated inside the cockpit armor. The attacker dropped in a straight line and plowed into the ground. Rechkalov destroyed the second HS-129. Dementiev disabled a third, which crash-landed in a scorched field. The escorts tried to retaliate, but Pokryshkin intercepted the nearest 109 in a snap-roll maneuver that caught the German completely off guard. He fired a brief burst, and the Messerschmitt disintegrated under the impact. Only one ground attack aircraft escaped. Only one escort survived with enough altitude to flee. Pokryshkin circled once above the smoking wrecks, then pointed his Airacobra toward the forward strip. His voice was steady when he spoke, but there was no mistaking the significance of what had happened. German pilots were beginning to fear the Airacobra. They had learned its silhouette the hard way. They had lost skilled men because they misjudged it. They had realized, too late, that this rejected American machine in Soviet hands had a predatory niche no German fighter could match. As Pokryshkin guided his aircraft home, the truth was undeniable. The front line had changed. So had the balance of intimidation in the air, and so had the reputation of the P-39. The runway dust had barely settled beneath Pokryshkin's wheels when the briefing officers rushed toward him, papers clutched in their hands, urgency carved into every movement. He hadn't removed his flight gloves yet, but they were already pointing at updated reconnaissance sketches, intercepted German transmissions, fresh reports from frontline observers, and one detail that tightened his focus more than anything else. A new Luftwaffe Gruppe had arrived in the sector. Not ordinary pilots, veterans, survivors from Kharkov and the Caucasus, men with long kill lists, accustomed to overwhelming their opponents on the first merge. The commander's voice was low but steady. "Pokryshkin, they're hunting specifically for your regiment now." He didn't react outwardly. He simply stepped closer to the map, studying the faint arc of German movement.